He was the man of steel, the absolute dictator who forged the Soviet Union through unimaginable terror and bloodshed, controlling the fate of hundreds of millions. Joseph Stalin wielded power like few in history. But the one small group of people whose lives he shaped most intimately and often most brutally were his own children, pawns, prisoners, and defectors in his terrifying game. What truly became of the sons and daughters who lived and often died under the suffocating shadow of the Kremlin's most feared and ruthless ruler, welcome. You clicked on this video because you know the name that defined the 20th century, but you sense the real human tragedy lies hidden within his own bloodline. In this exhaustive deep dive documentary, we will tell the complete multi-generational and largely untold story of the 5 children most closely connected to Joseph Stalin. We will explore the tragic fate of his firstborn son, Yakov Dzhugashvili, sacrificed on the altar of war. We will delve into the privileged yet self-destructive life of his second son, Vasily Stalin, the prince who fell from grace. We will follow the astonishing journey of his only daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva, who famously defected and denounced her father's legacy. We will uncover the story of his loyal adopted son, Artyom Sergeyev. And we will piece together the enigmatic puzzle of Konstantin Kuzakov, the alleged secret son from Stalin's exile. To bring you this incredible, harrowing story, we have gone far beyond the standard histories and the Kremlin propaganda. We have meticulously researched Soviet archives where accessible analyzed the memoirs of Svetlana Alliluyeva, consulted numerous scholarly biographies of Stalin and his inner circle, and navigated decades of historical debate and deliberate obfuscation. This is not just a superficial, "Where are they now?" It is a deep, unflinching exploration of the profound psychological and political consequences of being the child of absolute power and absolute terror. It's a story of survival, sacrifice, rebellion, and the inescapable weight of one of history's darkest legacies. Prepare to understand the human cost borne by the children of Stalin. Number 5. The Sacrificed Son. The tragedy of Yakov Dzhugashvili. The story of Stalin's children begins not in the Kremlin, but in the turbulent landscape of pre-revolutionary Georgia, with a son born to a young radical, a child overshadowed from birth by loss, and his father's burgeoning, ruthless ambition. His life would be a constant struggle for paternal acceptance, ending as a pawn in a brutal war. Sacrificed by the very father whose approval he craved. Born on March 18, 1907, in the Georgian village of Baji Yakov, Yosifovich Dzhugashvili was the first child of Joseph Stalin, then Yakov Dzhugashvili, and his first wife Ekaterina Svanidze. His arrival came during a period of intense revolutionary activity for his father, who was deeply involved in Bolshevik underground work, including bank robberies, organizing strikes, and evading the Tsarist police. Yakov's early life was marked by immediate tragedy. His mother Kato, whom Stalin reportedly loved deeply in his own way, died of typhus just 8 months after Yakov's birth. The loss devastated Stalin, hardening him further, and he left the infant Yakov to be raised by Kato's relatives in Georgia for the next 14 years. This extended separation during his formative years created a profound and lasting rift between father and son. Yakov grew up largely without knowing his father, hearing only stories of the distant revolutionary figure. When he finally joined his father in Moscow in 1921, the reunion was fraught with tension. Yakov was a shy, sensitive young man who spoke primarily Georgian, struggling to adapt to the harsh, demanding, and now powerful figure his father had become. Stalin, in turn, showed little affection or patience for his eldest son, often mocking his perceived softness, referring to him dismissively as the wolf cub, and criticizing his lack of revolutionary fervor. Yakov lived in the shadow of his father's second family, Stalin's new wife Nadezhda Alliluyeva, and their children Vasily and Svetlana, often feeling like an outsider in his own father's home within the imposing walls of the Kremlin. The relationship reached a crisis point when Yakov fell in love with Zoya Gunina, a fellow student, and announced his intention to marry her. Stalin vehemently disapproved, viewing the match as unsuitable. The resulting conflict and his father's relentless scorn drove Yakov to a desperate act. He attempted suicide by shooting himself in his room in the Kremlin apartment. The bullet missed his heart and he survived, but the incident only deepened Stalin's contempt. Upon hearing the news, Stalin reportedly sneered, "He can't even shoot straight." This chilling remark epitomized the cruel indifference Yakov faced. He eventually married Zoya, and they had a daughter, Galina. But the marriage was short-lived, possibly due to the continued pressure and instability. Despite the difficult relationship, Yakov sought to prove his worth, particularly through military service, a path valued by his father and the Soviet state. He studied engineering and eventually graduated from the Artillery Academy of the Red Army. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Senior Lieutenant Yakov Dzhugashvili went to the front lines commanding an artillery battery. Just weeks into the invasion, in July 1941, during the disastrous Battle of Smolensk, Yakov's unit was encircled, and he was captured by the Germans. The Nazis quickly recognized the immense propaganda value of capturing Stalin's eldest son. They disseminated leaflets and photographs of Yakov in captivity, hoping to demoralize Soviet troops and potentially use him as a bargaining chip. They even dropped leaflets over Soviet lines, showing Yakov looking healthy, urging soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. The German High Command eventually proposed a prisoner exchange, Yakov Dzhugashvili, for Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the German 6th Army, who had been captured after the devastating Soviet victory at Stalingrad. Stalin's response became legendary, a chilling testament to his ruthlessness, even towards his own son. He reportedly refused the offer, coldly stating, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." Some accounts add the even harsher line, "All Soviet soldiers are my sons," implying Yakov deserved no special treatment. Whether driven by cold political calculation, not wanting to show favoritism, or weakness, genuine belief that Yakov should have died rather than surrender in line with Order No. 270, which condemned captured officers as traitors, or a final cruel rejection of the son he never truly embraced, the decision sealed Yakov's fate. Yakov spent the next 2 years in German prisoner of war camps, primarily Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. The exact circumstances of his death remain debated. The official German account stated that he died on April 14, 1943, by deliberately running into an electric fence after refusing to obey orders. Soviet investigations after the war suggested he might have been shot by a guard while approaching the fence, perhaps in a final act of defiance or despair, driven by the hopelessness of his situation and abandonment. Regardless of the specifics, he died a prisoner abandoned by his father. Yakov's scandal was the tragedy of his capture and his father's refusal to save him. The untold story is the lifetime of rejection and emotional neglect that preceded it. His life was a constant futile struggle for the approval of a man incapable of showing him love, ending in the ultimate act of paternal abandonment. He was the first casualty among Stalin's children, a poignant symbol of the human cost of his father's absolute power and unforgiving nature. His daughter, Galina Dzhugashvili, lived a long life dedicated to defending her father's honor and challenging the official accounts of his death, adding another layer to this tragic legacy. Yakov's life was a story of rejection ending in sacrifice. But Stalin's next son, born into the heart of Soviet power, would experience the opposite extreme, suffocating privilege and indulgence, leading not to a hero's death, but to a long, slow, self-destructive spiral into disgrace. Number 4. The Fallen Prince. Vasily Stalin's life of excess and imprisonment. If the first son was the neglected wolf cub, the second son was the Kremlin prince born into absolute power, coddled, promoted, and ultimately corrupted by the very system his father commanded. His life would be a dizzying ascent fueled by nepotism and a catastrophic fall driven by arrogance, alcoholism, and the terror of living up to and then losing the protection of the Stalin name. Born on March 21, 1921, Vasily Iosifovich Stalin was the first child of Joseph Stalin and his second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. Unlike Yakov, Vasily grew up entirely within the suffocating embrace of Kremlin power. His childhood was one of extraordinary, almost unimaginable privilege in the context of Soviet society. He lived in Kremlin apartments and state dachas, attended exclusive schools for the elite, and was surrounded by the highest echelons of the Communist Party elite. His father was not just a distant figure. He was the absolute ruler, the object of a pervasive cult of personality. However, this privileged upbringing was deeply dysfunctional. His mother, Nadezhda, reportedly suffered from psychological issues and had a tumultuous relationship with Stalin. Her sudden death in 1932 officially ruled as appendicitis, but widely believed and later confirmed to be suicide following a public argument with Stalin, deeply traumatized the 11-year-old Vasily and his younger sister Svetlana. Stalin's reaction was reportedly cold and dismissive, further alienating his children. Vasily grew up largely without maternal affection and with a father who, while indulging him materially, was emotionally distant, demanding and often cruel, alternating between neglect and harsh criticism. Lacking strong parental guidance and surrounded by sycophants eager to curry favor with Stalin's son, Vasily developed into a spoiled, arrogant, and increasingly erratic young man. He was a poor student, but developed a passion for aviation. Leveraging his father's name, he enrolled in a flight school and embarked on a career in the Soviet Air Force VVS. His military career during and after World War II was a textbook example of nepotism run rampant. Despite his youth, lack of experience, and growing reputation for heavy drinking and insubordination, Vasily received astonishingly rapid promotions. He flew combat missions, but was often protected from the most dangerous assignments. By the age of 26, he was a lieutenant general and commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District. An absurdly high rank for someone of his age and qualifications. He lived lavishly used Air Force resources for personal gain, including famously creating and sponsoring successful VVS sports teams, particularly hockey and football, often forcing the best athletes in the country onto his teams, and surrounded himself with cronies. His behavior became increasingly reckless, marked by drunken escapades, womanizing, and abusing his authority. Stalin was reportedly aware of his son's excesses and occasionally disciplined him, sometimes harshly, but largely allowed his behavior to continue, perhaps seeing it as a reflection of his own power, or simply lacking the time or inclination to truly intervene. The crucial turning point came with his father's death in March 1953. Suddenly, Vasily's shield was gone. The new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev, eager to dismantle Stalin's cult of personality and consolidate their own power, had no tolerance for the disgraced son. Vasily, perhaps sensing his vulnerability or genuinely believing his father was murdered, he reportedly shouted accusations at the funeral, made a series of rash public statements, including claims about a conspiracy. Just weeks after Stalin's death, Vasily was arrested by the Ministry of State Security, MGB. He was charged with embezzlement, anti-Soviet propaganda, and gross negligence leading to aircraft accidents, stemming from a disastrous May Day fly-past incident in 1952, where planes crashed due to bad weather he allegedly ignored warnings about. He was stripped of his rank and privileges and sentenced to 8 years in the notorious Vladimir Central Prison under the name Vasily Vasilyev. His imprisonment was harsh, contributing to his declining health. After serving most of his sentence, Vasily was briefly released in 1960, but was quickly rearrested for further infractions, reportedly involving foreign diplomats, and continued drinking, and sent back to prison, and then into internal exile. He was eventually exiled to the city of Kazan, forbidden from returning to Moscow or Georgia. His health continued to deteriorate due to chronic alcoholism. Vasily Stalin died in Kazan on March 19, 1962, just shy of his 41st birthday. The official cause was chronic alcoholism. Vasily's scandals were numerous and public. His nepotistic career, his drunken rages, his corruption, his eventual imprisonment. The untold story is the tragedy of a life utterly warped and ultimately destroyed by unchecked privilege and the psychological burden of being Stalin's son, He was the prince who inherited a kingdom built on fear, indulged to the point of ruin, and then swiftly discarded when the king died. His life serves as a stark warning about the corrupting influence of absolute power, even on those closest to its source. Vasily's life was a fiery, self-destructive spectacle played out within the Soviet system. But his younger sister, Stalin's only daughter, would choose a different path of rebellion, not through internal decay, but through a stunning public act of escape and denunciation that would reverberate around the world. Number 3. The defector daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva's flight to freedom. She was the little sparrow, the dictator's darling daughter, seemingly destined for a life of quiet privilege within the Kremlin walls. But beneath the surface, a fierce intellect and a yearning for freedom simmered. Her story would become one of the Cold War's most sensational defections, a dramatic flight from the ghost of her father and a lifelong, restless search for identity beyond his monstrous shadow. Born on February 28, 1926, Svetlana Yosifovna Alliluyeva was the youngest child and only daughter of Joseph Stalin and Nadezhda Alliluyeva. Her early childhood, unlike her brothers, was marked by a degree of paternal affection. Stalin doted on his little sparrow, showering her with attention, a stark contrast to his treatment of Yakov and Vasily. She grew up in the privileged but emotionally sterile environment of the Kremlin, surrounded by fear and the ever-present cult of personality surrounding her father. Her world was shattered at the age of 6 by her mother's suicide in 1932. The event was shrouded in official lies, initially reported as appendicitis, and Svetlana only learned the truth years later from a foreign newspaper. A discovery that deeply wounded her and began her slow disillusionment with her father and the system he represented. As she grew older, her relationship with Stalin became increasingly strained. He disapproved of her first love, a Jewish filmmaker named Alexei Kapler, whom he exiled to the Arctic for 10 years. He interfered in her subsequent marriages and education, demanding absolute loyalty, while offering little genuine warmth or understanding. Svetlana pursued an academic path, studying history and literature at Moscow State University, finding solace and a measure of independence in the intellectual world. Despite the complexities, she remained within the Soviet system for years after her father's death in 1953. She worked as a lecturer and translator. She married several times and had 2 children, Joseph and Yekaterina, from her first 2 marriages within the Soviet Union. However, the legacy of her father, the weight of the Stalin name, and the constraints of Soviet life became increasingly unbearable. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's crimes at the 20th Party Congress, further complicated her position, confirming her worst fears about her father's reign and making her position within the Soviet elite precarious. The catalyst for her escape came in 1966. She had fallen deeply in love with Brijesh Singh, an Indian communist visiting Moscow. When Singh became ill and died, Svetlana was granted permission by the Soviet authorities after much difficulty to travel to India to scatter his ashes in the Ganges River. It was a rare opportunity to leave the Soviet Union. While at the Soviet embassy in New Delhi in March 1967, preparing to return, she made a sudden impulsive decision. She walked into the nearby United States Embassy and requested political asylum. Her defection was a global sensation, a massive propaganda coup for the West during the height of the Cold War. "Stalin's daughter defects," screamed headlines around the world. She was flown to the United States, where she held a press conference denouncing her father's regime and the Soviet system, calling him a moral and spiritual monster. Her arrival was met with immense public fascination. She quickly published her memoirs, 20 Letters to a Friend, 1967, which became an international bestseller. The book offered an unprecedented, intimate, and often critical glimpse into Stalin's private life and the suffocating atmosphere of the Kremlin. She followed this with only 1 year, 1969, detailing her defection and first year in the West. She became a wealthy woman in her own right through her writing. She attempted to build a new life in America, adopting the name Lana Peters after marrying architect William Wesley Peters, a former protege of Frank Lloyd Wright, in 1970. They had a daughter, Olga Peters, later Chris Evans. However, Svetlana's life in the West proved to be restless and often unhappy. She struggled to adapt, moved frequently between the US and the UK, and often felt exploited or misunderstood by the media and those around her. Her relationship with Peters ended in divorce. In a shocking move, she briefly returned to the Soviet Union in 1984, denouncing the West only to leave again just over a year later after failing to resettle, finding herself alienated there as well. Svetlana spent her final decades living in relative obscurity, often in near poverty despite her earlier book earnings, moving between England, America, and eventually settling in a nursing home in Wisconsin. She remained a complex and often contradictory figure, forever wrestling with the inescapable shadow of her father. She passed away from colon cancer on November 22, 2011. Svetlana's scandal was her sensational defection and her subsequent often critical revelations about her father and the Soviet system. The untold story is the lifelong poignant and ultimately unresolved search for identity and belonging that defined her existence. She was the daughter who escaped the physical confines of the Kremlin, but could never fully escape the psychological weight of being Stalin's child. Her life was a testament to the enduring power of the past and the immense difficulty of finding peace when born into the heart of darkness. Svetlana's dramatic defection was an act of profound rebellion against the Stalinist system. But within that same system, another son, adopted by Stalin, navigated a completely different path. One of quiet loyalty, military service, and surprising survival. Number 2. The adopted son. The loyal survivor, Artyom Sergeyev. Beyond the children born of his blood, Stalin's complex family circle included an adopted son, the orphaned child of a fallen Bolshevik comrade, raised alongside the volatile Vasily. This son would choose a path of unwavering loyalty and disciplined service, navigating the treacherous currents of Kremlin politics to become a decorated military officer and a quiet survivor of the Stalinist era and its aftermath. Artyom Fyodorovich Sergeyev, born in 1921, the same year as Vasily Stalin, was the son of Fyodor Sergeyev, a prominent Bolshevik revolutionary and close personal friend of Joseph Stalin, known by the revolutionary pseudonym Comrade Artyom. Fyodor Sergeyev played a key role in the early Soviet state, particularly in Ukraine, but died tragically in 1921 in the experimental crash of an aerowagon, a propeller-driven railcar, when Artyom was just an infant. Following his friend's death, Stalin took the young Artyom under his wing, effectively adopting him and raising him within the Kremlin alongside his own children, particularly Vasily, who became Artyom's closest childhood friend and near constant companion. Artyom's upbringing was therefore unique. He experienced the same Kremlin privileges as Vasily and Svetlana, witnessing Stalin's rule from the inside, but without the direct biological link and perhaps with a different psychological dynamic. He was treated as part of the family, yet always aware of his origins and his adopted status. His relationship with Stalin was reportedly less fraught than that of Stalin's biological sons. He was the loyal son of a fallen comrade, a position that perhaps afforded him a degree of respect or distance that Yakov and Vasily lacked. He grew up sharing Vasily's interests, particularly in the military. Like Vasily, Artyom pursued a military education and career, joining the Red Army's artillery forces. However, unlike Vasily, whose career was built on blatant nepotism and marked by recklessness, Artyom's military service appears to have been one of genuine merit and significant achievement. He fought bravely throughout World War II, reportedly being captured briefly by the Germans before escaping and rising through the ranks based on his abilities. He became a highly decorated artillery commander, eventually reaching the rank of Major General. His military career spanned decades, and he remained a respected figure within the Soviet armed forces long after Stalin's death, serving in various high-level positions. Artyom's survival and relative success, particularly in contrast to Vasily's downfall, are remarkable. How did he navigate the treacherous political landscape, especially after his adoptive father's death and the subsequent de-Stalinization? His close childhood bond with Vasily might have been a liability, yet he weathered the storm. This suggests a combination of genuine military competence, political acumen, and perhaps a degree of loyalty to the system, rather than just to the individual leader that allowed him to adapt. He married Amaya Ruiz Ibarruri, the daughter of the famous Spanish communist leader Dolores Ibarruri, La Pasionaria, further cementing his connections within the international communist movement. Artyom Sergeyev maintained a life of relative privacy, especially compared to Svetlana. But he did occasionally offer carefully worded reminiscences about his upbringing in the Kremlin in his later years, often focusing on correcting what he saw as historical inaccuracies. He remained largely loyal to the memory of Stalin as a father figure, while acknowledging the complexities of the era. He passed away in 2008 at the age of 86. His scandal is non-existent. The untold story of Artyom Sergeyev is the fascinating narrative of the adopted son who thrived. He represents a different model of navigating the Stalin legacy, one of loyalty, service, and quiet competence. While Yakov was sacrificed, Vasily self-destructed, and Svetlana defected, Artyom endured within the system, carving out a long and respected career. His life offers a unique perspective on the Kremlin's inner circle. The story of an insider who, despite his intimate connection to the dictator, managed to survive the purges, the war, and the political upheavals that followed, dying peacefully as a decorated veteran. Artyom's life was one of loyalty and survival within the system. But the final figure in this saga exists almost entirely outside the official record. The alleged illegitimate son, born in secrecy, whose connection to the dictator remains shrouded in ambiguity and speculation. Number 1. The alleged secret son. The enigma of Konstantin Kuzakov. Beyond the acknowledged children and the adopted son, whispers have long persisted of another child conceived not in marriage but during Stalin's harsh Siberian exile before the revolution. His life would unfold entirely under the shadow of this rumored parentage, a quiet career navigating the corridors of Soviet power forever, marked by an unspoken, unproven, yet potentially explosive secret. Konstantin Stepanovich Kuzakov was born in 1911 in the village of Solvychegodsk in northern Russia, where Joseph Stalin, then Dzhugashvili, was living in internal exile imposed by the Tsarist regime. His mother was Maria Kuzakova, Stalin's landlady during this period. Maria was a widow, and she and the exiled revolutionary reportedly developed a relationship. Konstantin was born shortly after Stalin left Solvychegodsk. While Stalin never formally acknowledged paternity, and Maria eventually married another man, who gave Konstantin his stepfather's name, the circumstances and timing led to persistent rumors and later claims that Konstantin was in fact Stalin's illegitimate son. Konstantin Kuzakov's life unfolded against the backdrop of the Soviet state his alleged father would come to rule. He reportedly joined the Communist Party and pursued higher education. Perhaps benefiting subtly from his rumored connection, or perhaps through his own abilities, he carved out a successful career within the Soviet bureaucracy, but notably not in the high-stakes world of frontline politics or the military. His domain was the relatively safer sphere of ideology, culture, and media. He held various positions within the Communist Party's Central Committee apparatus, related to propaganda and culture. His most prominent role came later in his career when he served as a high-ranking official in the USSR State Committee for Television and Radio Broadcasting, Gostele Radio, essentially becoming a deputy minister of culture overseeing television. Throughout his career, Kuzakov navigated a delicate path. He was aware of the rumors about his parentage. According to some accounts, during Stalin's purges in the 1930s, Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD secret police, presented Stalin with a file on Kuzakov, potentially highlighting the rumored connection. Stalin reportedly reviewed the file and ordered Beria to leave Kuzakov alone, allegedly saying, "Don't touch him." This intervention, if true, suggests Stalin was aware of the possibility and chose to protect him, albeit silently. In 1947, however, Kuzakov and his deputy were dismissed from their posts and expelled from the party, possibly as part of Beria's machinations or Andrei Zhdanov's ideological campaigns, though they were later reinstated after Beria's fall. Konstantin Kuzakov himself never publicly claimed Stalin as his father during the Soviet era. Doing so would have been incredibly dangerous. However, in interviews given much later in his life, during the glasnost period of the late 1980s and after the fall of the Soviet Union, he spoke more openly. He acknowledged the circumstances of his birth and the persistent rumors recounting the story of Stalin, potentially saving him from Beria. While still circumspect, his late-life statements lent significant weight to the claim, though definitive proof, like DNA evidence, has never been established. He passed away in 1996. His scandal is the lifelong ambiguity surrounding his birth. The untold story of Konstantin Kuzakov is the story of navigating an entire life under the shadow of an unproven but potentially lethal secret. If true, his parentage gave him a unique perilous status within the Soviet elite. He survived by maintaining a low profile, focusing on a bureaucratic career away from the center of power and demonstrating unwavering loyalty to the party line. His life is a fascinating study in ambiguity and survival within a totalitarian system, the quiet riddle of the alleged secret son who outlived the dictator and his tumultuous era. The 5 lives connected to Joseph Stalin, marked by sacrifice, excess rebellion, loyalty, and secrecy, paint a chilling portrait of the devastating human cost of absolute power. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that even history's most imposing figures leave behind intimate, often tragic, family legacies. But the challenge of navigating a monumental paternal legacy extends beyond dictators and into the lives of great heroes as well. Consider the family built by another giant of history, a man who fought against oppression, the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. On this channel previously, we explored the fascinating and complex story of Frederick Douglass's 5 children. Did you know that the heirs of this escaped slave turned global icon faced their own unique struggles? Grappling with racism, pursuing their own forms of activism, navigating complex family dynamics, including their father's controversial second marriage, and working to define themselves in the shadow of one of America's greatest heroes. The full untold story of the Douglass children is one you won't want to miss. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover that incredible untold story. And as always, thank you for watching.